Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On July 4th, 1831, in a modest townhouse on Prince Street in New York City, a 73-year-old man lay dying. James Monroe, the 5th President of the United States, the last of the revolutionary generation to hold that office, was suffocating slowly from tuberculosis that had ravaged his lungs for months. His daughter Maria Hester sat beside him, watching her father struggle for each laboured breath. The doctors had given up days ago. There was nothing more they could do. The room was warm despite the summer heat. The window stood open, hoping for a breeze that never came. Outside, New York prepared for its Independence Day celebrations, unaware that one of the men who had helped create that independence was slipping away above them. Monroe had been too ill to leave his room since December. An incessant cough had prevented rest, prevented peace, prevented anything but the slow march toward this inevitable moment. Throughout that long 4th of July, Monroe drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, he spoke little. His voice was too weak, his lungs too damaged. His wife Elizabeth had died just 10 months earlier, and the loss had broken something in him that never healed. He had moved to New York to live with Maria and her husband, Samuel Gouverneur, unable to bear the emptiness of Oak Hill, their Virginia estate, without Elizabeth beside him. At 3:30 in the afternoon, as church bells began to ring across the city, as cannons fired salutes from the harbour, as crowds gathered in the streets to celebrate the 55th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, James Monroe stopped breathing. His heart simply gave out. Worn down by age and illness and grief, he was gone. Maria looked at her father's face, finally at rest after months of suffering, and wept. The last of the founding father presidents had died. And he had died on the 4th of July, exactly 5 years to the day after Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had passed away, exactly 55 years after the nation he had helped build declared its independence from Britain. Consider the strangeness of this coincidence. 3 of the first 5 presidents, 3 of the men who'd been present at the creation of the American Republic, all dying on Independence Day. Monroe's death seemed almost orchestrated, as if history itself demanded this symbolic closing. The Virginia dynasty that had dominated American politics for a generation ended not with drama or fanfare, but with an old man's quiet surrender in a borrowed bedroom far from home. How does someone become James Monroe? How does the second son of a modest Virginia planter transform himself into a revolutionary soldier, a diplomat who helps purchase half a continent, a president who reshapes American foreign policy for a century? And what does it cost? Monroe would die deep in debt, having spent a lifetime in public service that left him financially ruined. He would die in his daughter's home because he could no longer afford his own. He would die knowing that slavery, the institution he had claimed to oppose but never truly challenged, was tearing apart the union he had worked to build. This is the story of a man who fought in the Revolution as a teenager, who carried a bullet in his shoulder for the rest of his life as a reminder of that service. A man who walked with Washington, studied with Jefferson, and governed during what would be called the era of good feelings, even as the nation fractured beneath the surface. A man whose single greatest achievement, the Monroe Doctrine, would echo through American foreign policy long after anyone remembered his name. But before James Monroe became president, before he became a diplomat or a soldier or a statesman, he was a boy growing up in the Virginia countryside, learning the rhythms of tobacco farming and the contradictions of a society built on human bondage. To understand the man who would die on that July 4th, we must return to another spring day 73 years earlier, to the world into which he was born. Before we begin this journey through the life of the last founding father president, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so leave a comment and let me know your location and the time where you are. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away as we travel back to colonial Virginia in the 1750s to a tobacco plantation in Westmoreland County, where on an April morning in 1758, a child was born who would witness the birth of a nation and shape its path for half a century. The Virginia of 1758, the Virginia of James Monroe's birth, was a colony at the height of its prosperity and on the edge of revolution. It was 1758, and King George II still sat on the British throne, though he would die within 2 years. The French and Indian War raged across the frontier, where British and colonial forces fought France and its Native American allies for control of the continent. But in the settled regions east of the mountains, in the Tidewater and Piedmont regions where tobacco grew thick and slaves worked from dawn to dusk, life proceeded with the rhythms it had followed for decades. The Virginia of 1758 was 151 years old, having been founded in 1607 as England's first permanent settlement in North America. Those early years had been brutal, with disease and starvation killing most of the original settlers. But Virginia had survived, and in the century and a half since Jamestown, it had transformed itself into the wealthiest and most populous of Britain's American colonies. By 1758, Virginia claimed approximately 340,000 inhabitants, though that number is inexact given the poor record-keeping of the era. Of those inhabitants, nearly half were enslaved Africans, making Virginia a society profoundly dependent on human bondage. The free population was overwhelmingly of English descent, with substantial minorities of Scots, Scots-Irish and Germans who had settled the backcountry regions. The colony's geography shaped everything about Virginia life. The Tidewater region, where the great rivers flowed into the Chesapeake Bay, was the oldest and wealthiest part of the colony. Here, along the James, the York, the Rappahannock, and the Potomac rivers, the first planters had established their estates. The rivers provided transportation, connecting inland plantations to the ocean-going ships that carried Virginia tobacco to London, Bristol, and Glasgow. A planter with river frontage could load his tobacco hogsheads directly onto ships at his own wharf, a tremendous economic advantage. The Piedmont region, rolling hills between the Tidewater and the mountains, had been settled more recently. The soil was good for tobacco and grain, though the lack of navigable rivers made transportation more difficult. Farmers in the Piedmont had to roll their hogsheads of tobacco overland to the nearest river or to central collection points, adding cost and difficulty to the enterprise. Beyond the Piedmont rose the Blue Ridge Mountains, and beyond them the Shenandoah Valley and the Allegheny Mountains, a vast frontier where Virginia's claims extended theoretically all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but practically ended wherever British settlement gave way to French trading posts and Native American villages. This frontier was where the French and Indian War was being fought, where young George Washington had led Virginia militia against French forces, where the future of the continent was being decided. Westmoreland County lay along the northern neck of Virginia, that peninsula of land between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers, where some of Virginia's most prominent families had their estates. This was the birthplace of Virginia's aristocracy. George Washington had been born here 26 years earlier at Pope's Creek, not far from where Monroe would be born. Robert E. Lee would be born here 39 years later at Stratford Hall. The Lees, the Carters, the Washingtons, the Ludwells, all the great families of Virginia had their roots in the northern neck. The soil was rich and fertile, a legacy of the alluvial deposits laid down by the rivers over millennia. The climate was humid and hot in summer, with long growing seasons ideal for tobacco cultivation. The access to the Potomac River meant easy transport to markets in Britain, though it also meant exposure to British naval power, a fact that would matter greatly in the years ahead. The landscape was one of cultivated fields and dense forests. tobacco fields spread across thousands of acres, the broad green leaves ripening under the summer sun. Between the fields stood stands of oak, pine, and hickory, forests that provided timber for construction and fuel. The Potomac itself was wide and tidal at this point, sometimes calm as glass, sometimes choppy with wind and current, always busy with boats and barges carrying goods and people up and down the river. The social structure was rigid. At the top stood the great planter families, the Carters and Lees and Washingtons, men who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves, who built brick mansions and sent their sons to England for education, who dominated the colonial assembly and the county courts. They were an aristocracy in everything but name, recreating the English gentry system in this new world. Below them came the middling planters, men who owned perhaps 500 to 1,000 acres, perhaps a dozen to 30 slaves, men who worked alongside their bondsmen, but who aspired to the wealth and status of the families above them. They lived in wooden houses, not brick mansions. They sent their sons to local schools, not to England. But they were respectable, and respectability mattered in Virginia. Further down came the small farmers and labourers, men who owned little or no land, who might have 1 or 2 slaves or none at all, who worked with their own hands and would never be wealthy but hoped to provide for their families and perhaps see their children rise a step higher. And at the bottom, making up nearly half of Virginia's population, were the enslaved Africans. Men, women, and children who were property, who could be bought and sold, who had no legal rights, whose labour was the foundation of all Virginia's wealth. The tobacco that made Virginia rich was planted, tended, harvested, and processed by enslaved hands. Every plantation, from the grandest to the most modest, depended on this forced labour. It was the original sin of Virginia, and it would haunt the state and the nation for centuries to come. Into this world, into this system of hierarchy and bondage, James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758, at Monroe's Creek, a small tributary of the Potomac River in Westmoreland County. The exact location of his birth is known, though the house itself no longer stands. A marker now indicates the spot where Monroe Hall, his family's modest plantation house, once stood. The Monroe family, James Monroe's father was Spence Monroe, a man whose position in Virginia society was solidly middling. He was not one of the great planters, but neither was he poor. He owned approximately 600 acres of tobacco land along Monroe's Creek, worked by a small number of enslaved people, whose exact number is not recorded but was probably fewer than 20. He was also a carpenter, a skilled tradesman, which gave him additional income and status beyond farming alone. Spence Monroe was of Scottish descent. His family had emigrated to Virginia in the middle of the 17th century, part of that great wave of Scots and Scots-Irish who had come to the American colonies seeking land and opportunity. The Monroes had done well enough. They had acquired land, built up their holdings, and established themselves as respectable members of Westmoreland County society. Spence was a man of principles, at least as far as his community was concerned. In 1766, 8 years after James's birth, Spence Monroe would sign the Westmoreland Resolves, a protest against the Stamp Act organised by Richard Henry Lee. It was a small act of defiance against British authority, the kind of gesture that would become increasingly common in the years ahead. That his father was willing to sign such a document would have impressed itself on young James's memory. Political resistance to British overreach was not something abstract or distant. It was something his own father participated in. James's mother was Elizabeth Jones Monroe, and little is known about her beyond her Welsh ancestry and the fact that she came from a prominent Virginia family. She bore Spence 5 children: Andrew, the eldest, then James, then Joseph Jones Monroe, named after Elizabeth's brother, then Spence Jr., and finally Elizabeth. The household was large, bustling, filled with children and the constant work of running a tobacco plantation. James was the second child, the second son. In Virginia's system of primogeniture, this meant he would not inherit the family estate. That would go to Andrew. James would have to make his own way in the world, would have to find his own path to success and status. This reality shaped everything that followed. He could not simply inherit wealth and position. He would have to earn them. The plantation where James spent his childhood was not grand. The house was wooden, probably a story and a half, with a few rooms on the main floor and sleeping space in the loft above. There would have been outbuildings, a kitchen house, a smokehouse, quarters for the enslaved workers, barns for tobacco curing, storehouses, workshops. The plantation was largely self-sufficient, producing most of what the family needed to survive. Young James would have grown up surrounded by the sights and sounds and smells of tobacco cultivation. The spring planting, when the tiny seedlings were transplanted from the seed beds to the fields. The summer growing season, when the tobacco plants shot up to 6 feet tall and had to be constantly tended, weeded, suckered. The fall harvest, when the mature leaves were cut and hung in barns to cure. The winter processing, when the dried tobacco was stripped from the stalks, sorted by quality, packed into hogsheads, and rolled to the Potomac for shipment to England. He would have been surrounded too by enslaved people. The faces of the men and women who worked the fields and tended the house would have been as familiar to him as his own family. This was normal in Virginia, unremarkable. A white child growing up on a plantation learned early that black people were property, that slavery was the natural order of things, that the system that gave his family comfort and status was built on the bondage of others. James Monroe absorbed these lessons along with everything else. He would grow up to be a slaveholder himself, owning at various points in his life as many as 250 enslaved people. And though he would claim in later years to favour gradual emancipation, he would free exactly one enslaved person in his entire life, and that only on his deathbed. Education and early loss. James Monroe's formal education began when he was 11 years old. In 1769, he was sent to Campbelltown Academy, also known as Parson Campbell's School, one of the finest schools in Virginia. The academy was run by Reverend Archibald Campbell, a Scottish minister who had established a reputation for rigorous classical education. At Campbelltown, James studied Latin and mathematics, history and rhetoric, the subjects that marked a gentleman's education. He was a good student, quick to learn, with a particular aptitude for languages and history. Among his classmates was a boy named John Marshall, who would grow up to become Chief Justice of the United States. The two boys formed a friendship that would last throughout their lives, though they would often find themselves on opposite sides of political questions. The education James received at Campbelltown was classical, modelled on British grammar schools. Students read Cicero and Virgil in Latin, studied Euclidean geometry, memorised passages from Shakespeare and Milton. The goal was to produce educated gentlemen who could take their place in Virginia society, who could serve in the House of Burgesses or manage large estates or enter the professions of law or medicine or the ministry. But James Monroe's education at Campbelltown was cut short by tragedy. In 1774, when James was 16 years old, his mother died. The exact date and cause of her death are not recorded, which was not unusual for the time. Women's lives, even in prominent families, were often poorly documented. Elizabeth Jones Monroe died sometime in early 1774, leaving Spence Monroe with 5 children ranging in age from their late teens to perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The household must have been thrown into chaos. In 18th century Virginia, women were responsible for managing the domestic sphere, for supervising the enslaved house servants, for organizing meals and clothing and the 1,000 details of daily life. Without Elizabeth, the Monroe household would have struggled. But there was little time to grieve. Later that same year, tragedy struck again. Spence Monroe died. Again, the exact date and cause are not recorded, though it was likely sometime in the fall of 1774. At 16, James Monroe was effectively orphaned. His older brother Andrew inherited the family estate as primogeniture demanded. But Andrew was himself barely grown, unprepared to take on the burden of managing the plantation and raising his younger siblings. It was at this point that Joseph Jones stepped forward. Jones was Elizabeth Monroe's brother, James's uncle. He was a prominent man in Virginia, a member of the House of Burgesses, a close friend of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Jones had no children of his own, and he took on the role of guardian and mentor to his orphaned nephew. Jones was impressed by James's intelligence and character. The boy was serious, hard-working, and showed promise. Jones arranged for James to continue his education, enrolling him at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg in the summer of 1774. It was an extraordinary opportunity. William and Mary was the finest college in Virginia, the second oldest institution of higher learning in the American colonies. To attend William and Mary was to join the ranks of Virginia's elite. James Monroe arrived in Williamsburg in the summer of 1774, a tall, lanky 16-year-old boy with blue-grey eyes and brown hair, carrying the weight of recent losses and the hope of future success. Williamsburg was the capital of colonial Virginia, a city of perhaps 2,000 permanent residents that swelled to many more when the House of Burgesses was in session. It was the centre of Virginia's political and cultural life, and it was on the verge of becoming the centre of revolution. The Revolutionary Storm, James Monroe entered William and Mary in the fall of 1774, but he would not stay long enough to graduate. The college itself was small, with perhaps 60 to 80 students and a handful of professors. The curriculum emphasized classics, mathematics, natural philosophy, and moral philosophy. Students lived in the Wren Building, the main college building that still stands today, and attended lectures and recitations according to a rigorous schedule. But Williamsburg in 1774 was electric with political tension. The Stamp Act crisis had passed, but new grievances against British rule emerged constantly. The Tea Act had led to the Boston Tea Party the previous year. In response, Parliament had passed the Coercive Acts, what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor and stripping Massachusetts of many of its traditional rights. The First Continental Congress had met in Philadelphia in September 1774, just as Monroe arrived in Williamsburg. Virginia was at the forefront of resistance to British rule. The House of Burgesses, meeting in the Capitol building just down Duke of Gloucester Street from the college, was filled with men who had become leaders of the Revolution: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. These men met in taverns and private homes, planning responses to British actions, organising networks of correspondence with other colonies, preparing for whatever might come. Young James Monroe was caught up in this revolutionary fervour. He and his fellow students at William and Mary talked endlessly about politics, about rights and liberty, about whether armed resistance might be necessary. The students formed a militia company, drilling on the college green with whatever weapons they could obtain. In April 1775, news reached Williamsburg that fighting had broken out in Massachusetts. British regulars and colonial militia had clashed at Lexington and Concord. Blood had been shed. The revolution had begun. Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, grew nervous. In the pre-dawn hours of April 21st, 1775, he ordered British Marines to seize the gunpowder stored in the magazine in Williamsburg. It was a provocative act, depriving the colony of military supplies just as tensions were escalating. The response was immediate. Militia companies across Virginia began mustering. Patrick Henry led a force toward Williamsburg, demanding that the gunpowder be returned or paid for. The confrontation was eventually diffused, but it marked the point of no return. Virginia and Britain were now on the path to war. James Monroe and a group of fellow students decided to act. On the night of June 24th, 1775, they broke into the governor's palace, the official residence of Lord Dunmore, and raided its arsenal. They made off with approximately 200 muskets and 300 swords, which they promptly delivered to the Virginia militia. It was an act of rebellion, of outright defiance against royal authority. It was also an act that could have gotten them hanged for treason if the British had regained control. Lord Dunmore fled Williamsburg shortly after, taking refuge on a British warship in the York River. He would attempt to maintain his authority from offshore, but his power in Virginia was finished. And James Monroe, at 17 years old, had participated in his first revolutionary action. The college struggled to maintain operations as Virginia descended into war. Many students left to join militia units. Professors departed. By early 1776, it was clear that normal academic life was impossible. James Monroe made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He left William and Mary without graduating and enlisted in the 3rd Virginia Regiment of the Continental Army. He was 18 years old, tall and physically strong from years of outdoor work on the plantation. He had no military experience beyond the drilling done by the student militia company. But he was intelligent, literate, and motivated by a fierce commitment to the revolutionary cause. On September 28, 1775, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in the 3rd Virginia Regiment under Colonel Hugh Mercer. The Revolution, for James Monroe, was not a political abstraction. It was not something to be debated in drawing rooms. It was something to be fought for, bled for, suffered for. And he would do all three. The soldier, the 3rd Virginia Regiment, was ordered north to join General George Washington's Continental Army in New York. Monroe travelled with his regiment through Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, part of a force of approximately 700 Virginians marching to reinforce Washington's beleaguered army. By the time the Virginians arrived in New York in September 1776, the military situation was desperate. Washington had attempted to defend New York City against a massive British force under General William Howe. The British Army, supported by the Royal Navy and reinforced by thousands of Hessian mercenaries from Germany, vastly outnumbered and outgunned the Americans. Washington had been forced to abandon Manhattan, retreating first to Harlem Heights, then across the Hudson River to New Jersey. Monroe saw his first action at the Battle of Harlem Heights on September 16, 1776, a small engagement that was technically an American victory, but did nothing to change the strategic reality that Washington was being pushed steadily backward. Over the next weeks, Monroe participated in the long, dispiriting retreat across New Jersey. The Continental Army fell back from one position to another, always just ahead of the pursuing British, losing men to desertion and expired enlistments, dwindling daily. By early December, Washington's army had crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. The British army settled into winter quarters, establishing a line of outposts across New Jersey. The largest of these was at Trenton, where approximately 1,400 Hessian soldiers under Colonel Johann Rall made their headquarters. Washington needed a victory. His army was melting away. Enlistments were expiring at the end of December. Congress was in a panic, fleeing Philadelphia ahead of the British advance. The cause seemed lost. Washington decided on a desperate gamble, a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. On Christmas night 1776, Washington began moving his army back across the Delaware River. The weather was brutal, a winter storm bringing sleet and freezing rain. Ice clogged the river, making the crossing treacherous. The soldiers crossed in Durham boats, large cargo vessels used for ferrying iron ore, struggling against the current and the ice. James Monroe crossed with his unit, cold and soaked and terrified. None of them knew if they would survive the night. The plan required the army to cross the river, march 9 miles through the storm and attack at dawn. Everything had to go perfectly, and nothing ever went perfectly in war. But this time, somehow, it did. The Continental Army reached Trenton just after dawn on December 26th. The Hessians, exhausted from Christmas celebrations and convinced that no army would move in such weather, were caught completely by surprise. Washington's forces attacked from 2 directions, driving into the town with artillery and musket fire. Lieutenant James Monroe was ordered to lead a small group of soldiers in a flanking movement designed to capture the Hessian artillery before it could be brought into action. Monroe and his men charged toward the Hessian gun positions, running through the icy streets of Trenton under fire. They reached the guns. There was a brief, chaotic fight. And then James Monroe felt a massive blow to his left shoulder, as if he'd been struck with a sledgehammer. A musket ball had hit him, severing the subclavian artery in his shoulder. Blood began pouring from the wound. Monroe should have died within minutes. An arterial wound of that severity would normally cause a man to bleed to death in a matter of moments. But among the soldiers nearby was Dr. John Riker, a regimental surgeon. Riker reached Monroe almost immediately, saw the wound, and understood that only immediate action could save the young lieutenant's life. He tied off the artery on the spot, there in the freezing street amid the sounds of battle. It saved Monroe's life. He was carried from the field, conscious but in shock from blood loss and pain. The battle raged on without him. The Americans won a complete victory, capturing nearly 900 Hessians and all their supplies and artillery. It was the first significant American victory of the war, and it came at the moment when the cause seemed most hopeless. James Monroe had participated in one of the most famous battles of the American Revolution. John Trumbull's famous painting, The Capture of the Hessians at Trenton, shows the moment after the battle, with the wounded Lieutenant Monroe visible in the scene, his hand wrapped in a bloody bandage. For his courage at Trenton, Monroe was promoted to captain. General Washington himself signed the commission, but Monroe would carry the wound for the rest of his life. The musket ball remained lodged in his shoulder. Doctors could not safely remove it without risking further damage. For the next 55 years, until his death, James Monroe would carry that piece of lead in his body, a permanent reminder of December 26, 1776. The Long War. Monroe recovered from his wound over the winter of 1776 to 1777, convalescing in Pennsylvania before rejoining the army in the spring. He was promoted again, this time to major, and assigned as an aide-de-camp to Major General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling. Stirling was a New Jersey general who claimed a Scottish earldom and the title Lord, though the British House of Lords never recognised the claim. Regardless of his title, Stirling was an effective commander, and he took the young Major Monroe under his wing. As Stirling's aide, Monroe participated in the Philadelphia campaign of 1777. He fought at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777, where the Continental Army attempted unsuccessfully to prevent the British from capturing Philadelphia. He was present at the Battle of Germantown on October 4, 1777, another American defeat. He watched the wounded Marquis de Lafayette being helped from the Brandywine battlefield, his leg shattered by a musket ball. In December 1777, Monroe marched with the army to Valley Forge, the winter encampment that would become legendary for its suffering. Valley Forge was not a battle, but an ordeal. The Continental Army, approximately 12,000 strong, settled into a windswept plateau in the Pennsylvania countryside to wait out the winter. They built log huts for shelter, foraged for food, drilled endlessly under Baron von Steuben's training regimen, and tried not to freeze or starve. Monroe shared a hut with his old schoolmate John Marshall, who had also joined the Virginia forces. The two young men huddled together for warmth, rationing meagre supplies, watching men die of disease and cold. Approximately 2,000 soldiers died at Valley Forge that winter, not from British bullets, but from typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and malnutrition. Monroe survived the winter, as did the army. In June 1778, the British abandoned Philadelphia and began marching back toward New York. Washington pursued, and the two armies clashed at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey on June 28, 1778. It was a confused, brutal battle fought in 100-degree heat. Monroe participated, performing his duties as Sterling's aide, carrying orders and coordinating troop movements. The battle ended in a tactical stalemate, but Washington had proven that the Continental Army could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. But after Monmouth, Monroe's military career stalled. He had been promoted twice for valour. He had served with distinction for 3 years. He wanted a field command, a regiment of his own to lead. General Washington wrote letters of recommendation supporting Monroe's request for a colonelcy and an independent command. But the war in the North had settled into a stalemate, and there were no new regiments being raised. Monroe returned to Virginia in the fall of 1778, commissioned as a lieutenant colonel by Virginia's governor, but without troops to command. The Virginia Assembly promised to raise a regiment for him, but the state's resources were exhausted. No regiment was ever raised. Monroe found himself in an impossible position. He held a military rank but had no military command, no soldiers, no role to play. For a young man who had spent the past 3 years in constant action, who had been wounded in battle, who had endured Valley Forge and marched hundreds of miles and risked his life repeatedly, this sudden idleness was maddening. Monroe wanted to serve. He wanted to fight. But there was nothing for him to do. It was at this low point that his uncle Joseph Jones intervened once again. Jones recognized that Monroe's military career had reached a dead end. He suggested a different path, the law. If Monroe could not serve the Revolution with a sword, he could serve it with his mind. Jones arranged for Monroe to study law under the best possible teacher in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, who had recently become governor of the state. The education of a statesman. In the spring of 1780, James Monroe began reading law under Governor Thomas Jefferson in Richmond, the new capital of Virginia. Jefferson had moved the capital inland from Williamsburg for security reasons, as British forces threatened the coast. Monroe followed him there, beginning what would become one of the most important relationships of his life. Jefferson was 37 years old, already famous as the author of the Declaration of Independence. Monroe was 22, a war veteran with no formal legal training but with intelligence, discipline, and a hunger to learn. Jefferson saw promise in the young man and took him on as both student and protege. The relationship went beyond the traditional teacher-student dynamic. Jefferson needed help managing Virginia's war effort as governor, and Monroe proved to be a capable assistant. Monroe carried messages, coordinated with military commanders, helped organize supplies for the Continental Army and for the state's militia. He learned statecraft and administration by doing it, watching how Jefferson balanced competing demands and managed scarce resources. Jefferson in turn introduced Monroe to the political philosophy that would shape his career. They discussed Locke and Montesquieu, debated the nature of republican government, explored questions of federalism and states' rights. Jefferson was a brilliant teacher, and Monroe was an eager student. the two men formed a bond that would last until Jefferson's death 46 years later. Monroe's legal studies were interrupted periodically by military service. In 1780 and 1781, British forces under Lord Cornwallis invaded Virginia, and Monroe served with the state militia attempting to resist the invasion. He was present in Richmond in January 1781 when Benedict Arnold, now fighting for the British, raided the city and nearly captured Governor Jefferson. Monroe helped organise the evacuation and the removal of government records to safety. But the war was winding down. In October 1781, Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, effectively ending major combat operations. Monroe had missed the final climactic battle, serving instead with militia forces nearby. The war would officially continue until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, but the fighting in America was over. Monroe completed his legal studies and was admitted to the Virginia bar in 1782. He was 24 years old, a war veteran, a trained lawyer, and ready to begin a career in politics. His uncle Joseph Jones helped again, securing Monroe's election to the Virginia House of Delegates from King George County in April 1782. Monroe served only 2 months in the House of Delegates before being appointed to Virginia's Council of State, an advisory body to the governor. But his real opportunity came in 1783 when he was elected as a delegate to the Continental Congress, the national government under the Articles of Confederation. The Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, then briefly in Princeton, New Jersey, then in Annapolis, Maryland, and finally in New York City, moving from place to place as circumstances demanded. Monroe took his seat in November 1783, joining a body that included some of the most talented men in America: Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. As a delegate, Monroe served on numerous committees dealing with Western lands, Native American relations, and national finance. He travelled extensively, visiting the Western territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains to investigate land claims and relations with the Native American tribes. He learned diplomacy, compromise, the art of building coalitions. He was building a reputation as a serious, capable politician. It was also in New York during his service in Congress that Monroe met Elizabeth Cartwright. She was the daughter of Lawrence Cartwright, a prosperous New York merchant, and Hannah Aspinwall. Elizabeth was beautiful, elegant, and cultured. She was 17 years old when Monroe met her. He was 27. They courted through 1785, and on February 16, 1786, they married in New York. Monroe was deeply in love. Elizabeth was refined and sophisticated in ways that his Virginia upbringing had not prepared him for. She brought polish and grace to his life, and she would prove to be a formidable political asset in the years ahead. The marriage also brought some financial benefit. Elizabeth's father gave the couple money and connections in New York's merchant community. But Monroe was not wealthy, and he needed to establish himself in a profession that could support a family. He decided to return to Virginia and open a law practice. The Monroes moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1786. Monroe opened a law office and began building a practice. He was competent but not passionate about law. He took cases, earned fees, established himself as a respectable attorney. But his heart was in politics, and he continued to seek opportunities for public service. The constitutional debates. In 1787, a convention met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. What emerged instead was an entirely new constitution, creating a much stronger federal government with a president, a bicameral Congress, and a federal judiciary. The Constitution had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states to take effect, and ratification was far from certain. Virginia's ratifying convention met in June 1788, and James Monroe was elected as a delegate. He opposed ratification, not because he opposed strong government in principle, but because the proposed constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. Monroe believed that without explicit protections for individual liberties, the new federal government could become tyrannical. He joined the anti-federalist faction at the convention, aligning with Patrick Henry and George Mason in opposition to James Madison and other supporters of ratification. The debates were intense, running for weeks. Monroe argued passionately for amendments that would protect individual rights before ratification. But he was outmaneuvered. Madison and the Federalists promised that a Bill of Rights would be added through the amendment process after ratification. On this basis, Virginia narrowly voted to ratify the Constitution on June 25, 1788. Monroe had lost the fight, but he had earned respect for the principled nature of his opposition. When elections for the first Congress under the new Constitution were held in 1789, Monroe ran for a seat in the House of Representatives against his friend James Madison. It was an awkward campaign, two friends on opposite sides of a political divide. Madison won, but Monroe's strong showing demonstrated his political strength in Virginia. Monroe did not have to wait long for another opportunity. In November 1790, Virginia Senator William Grayson died unexpectedly. The Virginia legislature needed to appoint someone to fill the remainder of his term. They chose James Monroe. At age 32, Monroe entered the United States Senate as one of Virginia's two senators. He took his seat in December 1790, joining a body that included some of the most powerful men in the new nation, and he immediately found himself in the middle of the bitter political battles that were already beginning to tear the country apart. The rise of political parties. The early 1790s saw the emergence of America's first political parties, though the founders had hoped to avoid such factions. On one side stood the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, and supported by President Washington and Vice President Adams. The Federalists favoured a strong federal government, close ties with Britain, and aggressive federal action to promote economic development. On the other side stood the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They favoured a more limited federal government, closer ties with France, and protection of states' rights against federal encroachment. Monroe aligned himself firmly with the Democratic Republicans. He opposed Hamilton's financial program, which included federal assumption of state debts, creation of a national bank, and protective tariffs. Monroe believed these measures concentrated too much power in the federal government and favoured northern commercial interests at the expense of southern agricultural interests. The political battles became increasingly bitter. Monroe participated in one particularly ugly incident in 1792, when he and two other members of Congress investigated rumours that Treasury Secretary Hamilton was misusing federal funds. The investigation uncovered evidence that Hamilton had been making payments to a man named James Reynolds. Hamilton admitted the payments, but claimed they were part of a personal affair. He had been having an affair with Reynolds's wife, Maria, and was paying Reynolds to keep quiet about it. Hamilton showed Monroe and the other investigators his correspondence with Maria Reynolds to prove the affair, thereby demonstrating that the payments were for blackmail, not embezzlement. Monroe agreed to keep the matter private, protecting Hamilton's reputation. But years later, the Reynolds affair became public anyway, creating a scandal that damaged Hamilton politically. Hamilton blamed Monroe for the leak, though Monroe denied responsibility. The two men nearly fought a duel over the matter before intermediaries convinced them to stand down. Monroe served in the Senate until 1794, consistently supporting Democratic-Republican positions and opposing the Washington administration's policies. He was one of the leading voices of the opposition, and his prominence did not go unnoticed. In 1794, President Washington made a surprising decision. he needed to appoint a new minister to France, and he chose James Monroe. It was an odd choice in some ways. Monroe was a known opponent of Washington's policies and a partisan Democratic Republican. But that was precisely why Washington chose him. France was angry about the Jay Treaty, which had been negotiated with Britain and which France saw as pro-British. Washington hoped that appointing a minister known to be sympathetic to France might smooth relations. Monroe accepted the appointment and sailed for France with Elizabeth in June 1794. He was 36 years old, and he was about to discover that diplomacy was far more complicated than he had anticipated. The French mission. Monroe arrived in Paris in August 1794 during the Reign of Terror, the most radical phase of the French Revolution. The guillotine was still in heavy use. Robespierre had just been executed. The revolutionary government, the National Convention, was attempting to consolidate power and fight off enemies both foreign and domestic. Monroe's instructions from the Washington administration were to maintain neutrality between Britain and France while reassuring the French of American friendship. It was an impossible task. The Jay Treaty, then being negotiated with Britain, contained provisions that France would see as violations of the 1778 alliance between America and France. Monroe did not know the full details of the Jay Treaty because Washington had not shared them with him. Monroe appeared before the National Convention to present his credentials and gave a speech that was far more enthusiastic about the French Revolution than the Washington administration would have wanted. He spoke of the bonds between the French and American revolutions, of shared republican principles, of eternal friendship. The French loved it. Monroe became immensely popular in Paris. But when the details of the Jay Treaty became public in 1795, the French were outraged. The treaty granted Britain most favoured nation trading status and settled various disputes in Britain's favour. France saw it as a betrayal of the Franco-American alliance. Monroe tried to explain, tried to defend American policy, but he was hamstrung by the fact that he himself disagreed with the treaty. The situation deteriorated. The French government began seizing American ships, claiming that the Jay Treaty had voided the alliance and that America was now an enemy. Monroe worked desperately to prevent a complete breakdown in Franco-American relations, but he lacked the support of his own government. In the fall of 1796, Washington recalled Monroe, blaming him for the failure to maintain good relations with France. Monroe was devastated. He had served for 2 years in an impossible position, given contradictory instructions, denied critical information, and then scapegoated when things went wrong. Monroe and Elizabeth sailed home in April 1797, arriving to find that Washington's Federalist administration had thoroughly discredited Monroe in the press. Monroe was furious. He believed he'd been treated unfairly, made a scapegoat for policy failures that were not his fault. In December 1797, Monroe published a 500-page pamphlet titled A View of the Conduct of the Executive in the Foreign Affairs of the United States. It was a detailed defense of his conduct as minister and a blistering attack on Washington's administration. The pamphlet was injudicious, excessive, and politically damaging. Washington never forgave Monroe for it, and the two men remained estranged until Washington's death in 1799. But among Democratic Republicans, Monroe's pamphlet made him a hero. He had stood up to Washington. He had defended Republican principles against Federalist tyranny. When Monroe ran for governor of Virginia in 1799, he won easily. Governor of Virginia Monroe served 3 one-year terms as governor of Virginia from 1799 to 1802. The governorship was not a powerful position under Virginia's constitution. The governor could not veto legislation, had limited appointment power, and was essentially the executive officer of the legislature rather than an independent power. But Monroe made the most of the position. He focused on education, internal improvements, and military preparedness. He strengthened the state militia, improved roads and canals, and advocated for a system of public education. He was a capable, conscientious administrator. The most dramatic event of his governorship came in August 1800, when Monroe learned of a planned slave rebellion. An enslaved blacksmith named Gabriel had organized a conspiracy involving potentially hundreds of enslaved people who planned to march on Richmond, seize the arsenal, and take the governor hostage. The rebels hoped to spark a general slave uprising across Virginia. The plot was betrayed by other enslaved people before it could be executed. Monroe called out the militia, and the conspirators were rounded up. Gabriel and 26 others were eventually hanged. Monroe handled the crisis firmly but without panic. He was aware of the horror of the plot, but also aware of the horror of the system that had provoked it. The Gabriel conspiracy terrified white Virginians. It confirmed their worst fears about slave rebellion and led to harsher restrictions on enslaved people across the state. Monroe and other Virginia leaders recognized that slavery was a problem, a source of potential violence and instability. But they could not imagine a solution. The economy was built on slave labor. Their own wealth depended on it. So they did nothing, and the problem festered. In 1803, Monroe's political fortunes changed dramatically. President Jefferson needed help negotiating the purchase of Louisiana from France. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing cash for his European wars, had offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. Jefferson sent James Monroe to Paris as a special envoy to assist the American minister Robert Livingston in the negotiations. Monroe sailed for France in March 1803. By the time he arrived in Paris in April, Livingston had already begun negotiations. Working together, Monroe and Livingston concluded the Louisiana Purchase on May 2, 1803, acquiring approximately 828,000 square miles of territory for $15 million. It was the largest land purchase in history, doubling the size of the United States overnight. Monroe returned to America a hero. He had helped secure one of the great diplomatic triumphs of the age. Jefferson was delighted. The Democratic Republicans celebrated. Monroe's political career was resurrected. Jefferson then appointed Monroe as minister to Great Britain, where he served from 1803 to 1807. Monroe worked to resolve ongoing disputes with Britain over neutral shipping rights and the impressment of American sailors. He negotiated a treaty with Britain in 1806, but Jefferson rejected it because it did not adequately address impressment. Monroe was disappointed but understood Jefferson's reasoning. Monroe returned to Virginia in 1807 and briefly considered running for president in 1808. But James Madison had Jefferson's support, and Monroe wisely chose not to challenge his old friend. Madison won the presidency, and Monroe retired to private life, or so he thought. But retirement would not last long. Secretary of State and War in 1811, President Madison offered Monroe the position of Secretary of State. Monroe accepted, taking office in April 1811. He was 53 years old, grey-haired but still vigorous, bringing decades of diplomatic experience to the position. Monroe took office at a critical moment. Relations with Britain had deteriorated to the breaking point. British ships continued to stop American vessels and impress American sailors. British policies restricted American trade with Europe. Western settlers blamed Britain for inciting Native American attacks on the frontier. War seemed inevitable. Monroe worked to find a diplomatic solution, but by June 1812, Madison had concluded that war was the only option. Congress declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. The War of 1812 had begun, and Monroe, as Secretary of State, would help manage the diplomatic side of the conflict. The war went badly at first. American invasions of Canada failed. The British blockaded the American coast. In 1814, British forces invaded the Chesapeake Bay region, marching on Washington. Madison's Secretary of War, John Armstrong, proved incompetent in organising the defence of the capital. In August 1814, as British forces approached Washington, Madison asked Monroe to take over the War Department, in addition to his duties as Secretary of State. Monroe agreed, serving simultaneously as both Secretary of State and Secretary of War for the next several months. Monroe rode out to Bladensburg, Maryland, on August 24, 1814, to observe the American forces attempting to stop the British advance. What he saw horrified him. The American militia was poorly organised, poorly led, and badly positioned. When the British attacked, the militia broke and ran. Monroe barely escaped the rout. The British marched into Washington unopposed and burned the Capitol, the White House, and other government buildings. It was a humiliating defeat. Monroe worked frantically to reorganize the defense of Baltimore, the British next target. American forces there, better prepared and better led, held off the British attack in September 1814. Francis Scott Key, watching the bombardment of Fort McHenry during the battle, wrote The Star-Spangled Banner. Peace negotiations had begun in Ghent, Belgium, even as the fighting continued. Monroe, as Secretary of State, coordinated American diplomatic strategy. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814, ended the war on the basis of status quo ante bellum. Neither side gained or lost territory. All the disputes that had caused the war remained unresolved. But Americans celebrated the Treaty of Ghent as a victory because the war had ended without the loss of territory, and because Andrew Jackson had won a dramatic victory at the Battle of New Orleans in January 1815, 2 weeks after the treaty was signed but before news of it reached the combatants. Monroe had proven himself during the crisis. He had taken charge when leadership was needed, had reorganized the War Department, had coordinated the defense of Baltimore. When the war ended, he was seen as one of the heroes of the conflict. In 1816, James Monroe was the obvious choice to succeed Madison as president. The Presidential Campaign of 1816. The Presidential Campaign of 1816 was notable for its lack of drama. The Federalist Party, discredited by its opposition to the War of 1812 and its association with the Hartford Convention, where some Federalists had discussed secession, was collapsing. The Democratic Republicans dominated national politics. Within the Democratic Republican Party, Monroe faced some opposition. Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford of Georgia had support among some party members. But Monroe had Madison's endorsement, Jefferson's support, and a long record of service to the party and the nation. The party caucus nominated Monroe, and he easily defeated the Federalist candidate Rufus King in the general election, winning 183 electoral votes to King's 34. James Monroe was inaugurated as the 5th President of the United States on March 4, 1817. He was 58 years old, grey and dignified, dressed in the old-fashioned knee breeches and buckled shoes of the revolutionary generation. He looked like what he was, the last president from that founding generation, a living link to the Revolution and the creation of the Republic. Monroe's inaugural address emphasized national unity. He spoke of the need to put aside partisan divisions, to work together for the common good. He noted that the long rivalry between Federalists and Democratic Republicans had largely ended with the collapse of the Federalist Party. He hoped that the nation could move beyond party politics altogether, could govern on the basis of principle rather than faction. It was an optimistic vision, and for a brief period it seemed almost achievable. The President's daily life. In the White House, James Monroe established routines that reflected both his formality and his work ethic. He rose early, typically before 6 in the morning, regardless of the season. His first hour was spent in private reflection and reading, often perusing newspapers from across the country to gauge public opinion and understand the issues facing different regions. Breakfast was at 7, a simple meal taken with Elizabeth when she was well enough to join him. Monroe was not a gourmand. He ate moderately, preferring plain food to elaborate cuisine. A typical breakfast might consist of bread, butter, cold meat left from the previous night's dinner, and coffee. He did not indulge in the heavy breakfast popular among wealthy Virginians, having developed simpler tastes during his years of military service. By 8 o'clock, Monroe was in his office, a room on the second floor of the White House that looked out over the grounds. The office was furnished simply: a desk, chairs, bookcases filled with law books and diplomatic correspondence, maps on the walls showing the expanding boundaries of the nation. Monroe's desk was always organized, papers sorted into neat piles, nothing left to chance or forgotten. Monroe worked methodically through the day's correspondence, reading each letter carefully, dictating responses to his secretary. He had a particular gift for administrative detail, for remembering the threads of complex negotiations, for tracking multiple issues simultaneously. This attention to detail served him well in managing the executive branch. Cabinet meetings were held regularly, usually twice a week. Monroe had assembled a strong cabinet, and he gave his secretaries substantial independence in managing their departments. But he also expected to be kept informed of all major decisions. The cabinet would gather in the cabinet room, a formal space where Monroe presided from the head of the table. The discussions could last for hours, with Monroe listening carefully to all views before rendering his decision. John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, would later write in his diary about these cabinet meetings. Adams noted Monroe's patience, his willingness to hear opposing viewpoints, his careful deliberation before making decisions. Monroe rarely showed anger or frustration, even when cabinet members disagreed sharply. He believed in reasoned debate and consensus building, though he did not hesitate to make final decisions when consensus proved impossible. Lunch was at 2 o'clock, usually a light meal taken at his desk or with a small group of advisers. Monroe did not believe in lengthy midday meals that interrupted the day's work. He would eat quickly and return to business. The afternoon hours were often devoted to meetings with members of Congress, foreign diplomats, or petitioners seeking appointments or favors. Monroe received visitors in the Blue Room or the Red Room, formal reception spaces designed to impress upon visitors the dignity of the presidency. He was courteous to all visitors, regardless of their status, listening carefully to their concerns even when he knew he could not grant their requests. Monroe had a particular talent for making people feel heard. He would listen intently, ask clarifying questions, and respond thoughtfully. Even those who left disappointed with his decisions often came away respecting his sincerity and fairness. This personal touch was part of what made Monroe so effective politically. He built loyalty through courtesy and attention. Evenings in the Monroe White House followed a pattern established by previous administrations. Formal dinners were held regularly, with guests including members of Congress, cabinet officials, foreign diplomats, and prominent citizens visiting Washington. Elizabeth Monroe, when her health permitted, served as hostess for these events. Elizabeth brought a European sophistication to White House entertaining, having lived in Paris and London during Monroe's diplomatic posts. She insisted on formality and protocol, which some Americans found off-putting. Unlike Dolly Madison, who had been famously warm and inclusive, Elizabeth Monroe maintained a certain reserve. She did not make social calls on the wives of officials, arguing that the president's wife should not be expected to engage in such rounds. This caused some resentment in Washington society, but Monroe supported his wife's position. The formal dinners themselves were elaborate affairs. the table would be set with the finest china and silver, much of it purchased during the Monroe's time in France. French cuisine was served, prepared by a French chef that Monroe had brought to America. Wine flowed freely, though Monroe himself drank moderately. The conversation ranged across politics, literature, science, and the arts, with Monroe participating thoughtfully, but not dominating the discussion. After the guest departed, usually around 10 o'clock, Monroe would return to his office for another hour or two of work. He would review documents that had arrived during the day, draft notes for speeches or messages to Congress, or simply think through the complex problems facing the nation. He rarely went to bed before midnight, and often worked later when crises demanded it. Monroe's physical appearance in these years was that of a man bearing the weight of office with dignity. He stood well over 6 feet tall, still erect and imposing despite his age. His hair had turned white, worn long and tied back in a queue in the old style. His face was lined with age and care, but his blue-grey eyes remained sharp and observant. He moved deliberately, without haste but without wasted motion. He dressed always in the fashion of his youth: black coat, knee breeches, white stockings, shoes with buckles rather than laces. The style was decades out of date by the 1820s, but Monroe wore it as a badge of identity. He was a man of the revolutionary generation, and he wanted everyone to remember that fact. The old-fashioned clothing was his uniform, marking him as a veteran of the founding era. Monroe's temperament was steady and even. He didn't rage or exult, did not swing between emotional extremes. He approached problems with calm deliberation, weighing options carefully before deciding. This temperamental steadiness was both a strength and, occasionally, a weakness. It made him an effective administrator, but sometimes slow to respond to rapidly evolving situations. He was not a natural orator like Patrick Henry or Henry Clay. His speeches were well crafted and thoughtful, but not particularly inspiring. He delivered them in a measured cadence without dramatic flourishes or emotional appeals. People respected his speeches for their substance rather than their style. In private conversation, Monroe was warmer and more engaging than his public persona suggested. He had a dry wit that emerged among friends. He enjoyed discussing history and political theory, drawing on his extensive experience to illuminate contemporary issues. Those who knew him well found him excellent company, though he was never the life of any party. Monroe's relationship with Elizabeth remained strong despite the challenges of public life. They had been married for more than 30 years by the time he became president, and they had weathered much together. Financial struggles, political defeats, long separations during diplomatic missions, the death of their infant son. Elizabeth's frequent illnesses worried Monroe deeply, and he was attentive to her needs, often cutting short meetings or declining invitations when she was unwell. His daughters, Eliza and Maria, were grown and married by the time Monroe became president, but he remained deeply involved in their lives. He worried about their welfare, helped them financially when he could afford it, and delighted in his grandchildren. Family was important to Monroe in ways that went beyond the public sphere. For all his years in politics, he never forgot that he was a father and grandfather first. The White House years were demanding but satisfying for Monroe. He believed he was serving the nation well, advancing its interests through careful diplomacy and sound administration. The acclaim he received during his goodwill tours confirmed his sense that the nation appreciated his efforts. These were, in many ways, the culmination of his life's work, the reward for decades of service. Monroe's approach to governance. James Monroe brought to the presidency a political philosophy shaped by decades of experience in diplomacy, administration, and legislative service. His approach to governing reflected both his democratic Republican principles and his pragmatic understanding of what was politically possible in the young republic. Monroe was a strict constructionist in matters of constitutional interpretation, believing that the federal government possessed only those powers explicitly granted by the Constitution. This put him at odds with the nationalist vision of Alexander Hamilton and later Whig politicians who favoured broad construction and expansive federal power. Monroe believed that the Constitution established a limited government, that powers not delegated to the federal government remained with the states and the people. But Monroe's strict constructionism was not absolute or dogmatic. He recognised that the nation faced practical challenges that demanded federal action, even when the constitutional authority for such action was ambiguous. His solution was to advocate for constitutional amendments that would explicitly grant needed powers rather than to interpret existing powers broadly. For example, Monroe supported federal funding for roads, canals, and other internal improvements that would bind the nation together and promote commerce. But he did not believe the Constitution granted Congress the power to fund such projects. His solution was to propose a constitutional amendment explicitly authorizing federal spending on internal improvements. When Congress declined to pursue the amendment, Monroe found other ways to support infrastructure development, such as using military appropriations to fund roads justified for national defense purposes. This approach characterized Monroe's presidency: principled but practical, committed to constitutional limitations but willing to find creative solutions when the nation's needs demanded action. He navigated between strict principle and pragmatic necessity, trying to advance the national interest while respecting constitutional bounds. Monroe's foreign policy approach was shaped by his years as a diplomat and his understanding of America's position in the world. He believed the United States should avoid entangling alliances with European powers, following Washington's advice in the Farewell Address. America was a new kind of nation, a republic in a world of monarchies, and it should chart its own course rather than becoming a satellite of European great powers. At the same time, Monroe understood that America could not isolate itself entirely from global affairs. The nation's commerce depended on international trade. Its security required managing relationships with powerful neighbours like Britain and Spain. The challenge was to protect American interests while maintaining independence of action. This thinking shaped the Monroe Doctrine, which asserted American primacy in the Western Hemisphere while promising non-interference in European affairs. It was a statement of both ambition and limits. America would dominate its own sphere, but would not attempt to reshape the world beyond the Americas. The doctrine reflected Monroe's realistic assessment of American power and interests. In domestic policy, Monroe sought to balance sectional interests and build national consensus. He understood that the United States was not a unified nation, but a federation of distinct regions with different economies, different social systems, and different visions of the future. The North was increasingly industrial and opposed to slavery's expansion. The South remained agricultural and dependent on slave labor. The West wanted cheap land and federal support for internal improvements. Monroe tried to navigate these tensions through compromise and consensus building. He appointed cabinet members from different regions. He supported policies that benefited different sections: protective tariffs for northern manufacturers, public land sales for western settlers, protection of slavery in the states where it existed for southern planters. It was a delicate balancing act, and Monroe knew it could not last indefinitely. The Missouri Crisis of 1819 to 1820 revealed how fragile the sectional balance had become. Monroe worked behind the scenes to support the Missouri Compromise, recognizing that the alternative might be disunion. He believed the compromise bought time, that perhaps in future years a solution to the slavery question might emerge. He was wrong about that, but he was right that the immediate crisis needed to be diffused. Monroe's views on slavery itself were complex and contradictory. He acknowledged that slavery was morally wrong, that it contradicted the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that it represented a stain on American democracy. In private correspondence, he expressed hope for gradual emancipation, for some process by which slavery might be ended over time without economic catastrophe or racial conflict. But Monroe never acted on these sentiments in any meaningful way. He continued to own slaves throughout his life. He supported the Missouri Compromise, which extended slavery into new territories. He endorsed the American Colonization Society, which proposed to solve the slavery problem by sending freed black Americans to Africa, a scheme that assumed black people could never be full citizens of the United States. Monroe's position on slavery reflected the fundamental contradiction of his generation. They proclaimed that all men were created equal while denying equality to enslaved black people. They understood slavery was wrong, but could not imagine a solution that did not threaten their own economic interests and social position. They postponed the reckoning, hoping that future generations would solve the problem they lacked the courage to address. In this failure, Monroe was no different from Washington, Jefferson, or Madison. All of them owned slaves. All of them expressed private discomfort with slavery. None of them took meaningful action to end it. They bequeathed to future generations a problem that would ultimately be solved only through the bloodiest war in American history. Monroe's administrative style emphasized delegation and team building. He selected strong cabinet members and gave them substantial autonomy in managing their departments. John Quincy Adams had free rein in conducting foreign policy. John C. Calhoun reorganized the War Department. William Crawford managed the Treasury. Monroe set overall policy direction, but trusted his subordinates to implement it. This approach had both strengths and weaknesses. It allowed talented individuals to use their expertise effectively. It freed Monroe to focus on big-picture issues rather than micromanagement. But it also meant that Monroe sometimes lost control of policy details, that cabinet members pursued their own agendas, that coordination between departments was sometimes poor. The cabinet meetings Monroe held were designed to address this problem. By bringing all the secretaries together regularly, Monroe could ensure that everyone understood overall policy direction, that conflicts between departments were resolved, that the administration spoke with one voice. The meetings were often lengthy and occasionally contentious, but they served their purpose of coordinating policy. Monroe's relationship with Congress was generally cooperative, though not always smooth. He understood that the president needed congressional support to achieve his agenda, that he could not simply dictate policy. He worked to build relationships with congressional leaders, invited them to dinner at the White House, consulted them on major decisions, and tried to accommodate their concerns when possible. But Monroe also asserted executive prerogatives when necessary. He vetoed bills he believed were unconstitutional. He made appointments without always consulting Congress. He conducted foreign policy with minimal congressional input, believing that diplomacy required executive discretion. He pushed back when Congress tried to encroach on executive powers. This balance between cooperation and assertion characterized Monroe's presidency. He was neither a weak president who deferred to Congress, nor a strong president who tried to dominate it. He worked within the constitutional system, using the tools available to the executive while respecting the legislature's role. Monroe's vision for America was of a nation that would expand westward, that would grow in population and wealth, that would remain republican in character while avoiding the corruption and decline that had destroyed other republics in history. He believed America had a special destiny, not to dominate the world, but to demonstrate that self-government was possible, that a free people could govern themselves without descending into tyranny or chaos. This vision was both inspiring and limited. It inspired Americans to see themselves as part of a great experiment in human freedom. but it was limited by its assumption that this freedom would be available only to white men, that Native Americans would be dispossessed, that enslaved black people would remain in bondage, that women would be excluded from political participation. Monroe's America was a nation of enormous potential and profound injustice, expanding territorially while contracting morally, proclaiming liberty while practicing oppression. Monroe himself embodied these contradictions, a Revolutionary War veteran who fought for freedom while owning slaves, a president who expanded the nation while destroying Native American sovereignty, a statesman who spoke of universal principles while applying them selectively. These contradictions would haunt America long after Monroe's death. The nation he helped build would face a civil war over slavery. The westward expansion he promoted would nearly exterminate Native American peoples. The Republican institutions he strengthened would be tested repeatedly by crises of their own making. But the nation would survive, would grow, would eventually extend its promises more broadly than Monroe ever imagined. Whether Monroe would have approved of this evolution is unknowable. He was a man of his time, limited by its prejudices and assumptions. But he contributed to creating institutions strong enough to outlast those limitations, flexible enough to adapt to new circumstances, resilient enough to survive even the contradictions built into their foundation. The era of good feelings. Shortly after his inauguration, Monroe embarked on a goodwill tour of the northern states. No president since George Washington had undertaken such a tour, and Monroe wanted to reach out to the former Federalist strongholds to demonstrate that the Democratic-Republican administration represented all Americans, not just the South and West. The tour lasted from June through September 1817, and it was a triumph. Monroe travelled through Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and other northern states. He visited military installations, inspected fortifications, met with local officials, attended dinners and receptions. In Boston, the heart of federalism, Monroe was greeted by enormous crowds. Children dressed in white lined the streets waving roses. Former Federalist leaders who would not have spoken to Monroe a few years earlier now attended banquets in his honour, toasted his health, and pledged their support for national unity. The Columbian Sentinel, a Federalist newspaper in Boston, published an article describing Monroe's visit under the headline, "Era of Good Feelings." The phrase captured something real. The bitter partisan warfare that had marked American politics since the 1790s seemed to be ending. One party dominated, but it was broad enough and inclusive enough to encompass most political viewpoints. Monroe himself seemed perfectly suited to this moment. Tall, formal, courteous, he had an innate dignity that people respected. He did not have Jefferson's brilliance or Madison's depth of learning, but he had judgment, experience, and a genuine commitment to the nation's welfare. People liked him. They trusted him. Monroe made strong cabinet appointments, trying to balance regional and factional interests. He appointed John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts as Secretary of State, bringing a Northerner into the highest cabinet position. He appointed John C. Calhoun of South Carolina as Secretary of War, giving the South a strong voice. William Crawford of Georgia served as Secretary of the Treasury. William Wirt of Virginia became Attorney General. It was a cabinet of talented men, and Monroe gave them substantial independence in running their departments. The era of good feelings was real, but it was also fragile. Beneath the surface, tensions remained. The question of slavery and its expansion into new territories would soon tear the nation apart. Economic problems would strain the national consensus. But for a few years, Monroe presided over a nation that seemed more united than it had been in decades. The foreign policy achievements. Monroe's greatest achievements as president came in foreign policy. Working closely with Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Monroe addressed several long-standing issues with foreign powers and articulated principles that would shape American foreign policy for more than a century. The first major achievement was the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817, which demilitarized the Great Lakes and established the US-Canadian border as an unfortified boundary. It was a small treaty but symbolically important, representing a commitment to peace between the United States and Britain. The second achievement was the Adams-Onnis Treaty of 1819, also called the Transcontinental Treaty. Spain, weakened by the Napoleonic Wars and facing revolutions throughout its American empire, was unable to control Florida. Seminole Indians used Florida as a base for raids into Georgia and Alabama. American settlers complained bitterly, and in 1818 General Andrew Jackson invaded Florida, seized Spanish forts, and executed 2 British subjects he accused of inciting the Seminoles. Jackson's invasion created an international crisis. Spain protested. Britain was outraged. Monroe's cabinet debated whether to repudiate Jackson's actions. Monroe and Adams decided instead to use the crisis as leverage. They offered Spain a deal: cede Florida to the United States, and the US would assume $5 million in claims by American citizens against Spain. Spain, unable to hold Florida anyway, agreed. The Adams-Onnis Treaty, signed in February 1819, gave the United States possession of Florida and established the western boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, extending from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. It was a major diplomatic triumph, expanding American territory and securing American borders. The third and most famous achievement was the Monroe Doctrine, announced in December 1823. By the early 1820s, most of Spain's colonies in Latin America had won their independence. New nations had emerged in Mexico, Central America, and South America. But there were rumors that Spain, supported by France and other European powers, might attempt to reconquer these territories. Britain, which had developed profitable trade with the new Latin American nations, opposed any European intervention. The British Foreign Secretary proposed that Britain and the United States issue a joint declaration warning against European intervention in the Americas. Former Presidents Jefferson and Madison both advised Monroe to accept the British offer, but Secretary of State Adams argued for a unilateral American declaration. In a cabinet meeting, Adams stated his position bluntly. It would be more dignified for the United States to announce its principles directly, rather than to appear as a junior partner to Britain. Monroe agreed with Adams. On December 2, 1823, in his annual message to Congress, Monroe declared what would become known as the Monroe Doctrine. The key points were clear. The Americas were closed to further European colonization. Any European intervention in the independent nations of the Americas would be considered a hostile act toward the United States, and in return, the United States would not interfere in European affairs or in existing European colonies in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine received little attention in Europe at the time. Britain's navy was what really deterred European intervention in Latin America, not American declarations. But the doctrine established principles that would echo through American foreign policy for more than a century. Theodore Roosevelt would invoke it to justify American intervention in Latin America. John F. Kennedy would cite it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Monroe Doctrine became one of the foundational statements of American foreign policy. The Missouri Crisis. The era of good feelings faced its greatest test in 1819, when Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a slave state. The question exposed the fault lines running beneath the surface of national unity. By 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states in the Union, maintaining a careful balance in the Senate. Admitting Missouri as a slave state would tip the balance in favor of the South. Northern representatives objected, arguing that slavery should not be allowed to expand into the new territories acquired through the Louisiana Purchase. The debate in Congress was bitter and ominous. Representative James Tallmadge of New York proposed an amendment that would gradually abolish slavery in Missouri, prohibiting the further introduction of slaves and freeing the children of slaves when they reached age 25. The House, dominated by Northern representatives, passed the Tallmadge Amendment. The Senate, evenly divided, rejected it. For months, Congress deadlocked. Monroe watched with growing alarm. The question of slavery was tearing apart the fragile national consensus he had worked to build. He worried that the nation might fracture over the issue. The solution emerged in 1820 through a series of compromises negotiated by Henry Clay. Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state, balancing Missouri's admission as a slave state. More significantly, Congress agreed that slavery would be prohibited in the Louisiana Purchase territory, north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude line, except within Missouri itself. Monroe had supported the compromise behind the scenes, quietly encouraging its passage while remaining publicly neutral. He signed the Missouri Compromise into law in March 1820, believing it had resolved the crisis. But the crisis had revealed something terrifying. Thomas Jefferson, writing from Monticello, said the Missouri debate sounded to him like a fire bell in the night, a warning of disaster ahead. The question of slavery had not been resolved. It had merely been postponed, and the postponement would last only until the next time new territory sought admission to the Union. Monroe understood this, though he tried not to dwell on it. He believed in gradual emancipation in theory, but he owned slaves and continued to own them. He believed slavery was wrong, but he did nothing meaningful to end it. He was trapped, like so many of his generation, between his principles and his interests, between his ideals and his reality. The election of 1820. In 1820, Monroe ran for re-election. The Federalist Party was essentially defunct, and no serious opposition emerged. Monroe ran unopposed. When the electoral votes were counted, he had received all but one of the 232 electoral votes cast. A single elector, William Plumer of New Hampshire, voted for John Quincy Adams instead. Later mythology would claim that Plumer voted against Monroe so that only George Washington would have the honour of a unanimous electoral vote. Plumer's own writings show this was false. He voted for Adams because he genuinely believed Adams would make a better president, and because he had policy disagreements with Monroe's administration. Nonetheless, Monroe's near-unanimous re-election was a stunning endorsement. No president since Washington had enjoyed such broad support. Monroe began his second term in March 1821 with the confidence that the nation approved of his leadership. His second term would be marked by continued foreign policy successes but growing domestic tensions. The Panic of 1819, an economic depression triggered by the collapse of the post-war boom, caused widespread hardship. Banks failed, land values plummeted, unemployment rose. Monroe could do little to address the crisis, as the federal government had few tools for economic intervention. Political factions were re-emerging. The era of good feelings was ending as ambitious politicians jockeyed for position ahead of the 1824 presidential election. The Democratic-Republican Party was splitting into factions supporting different candidates: John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Andrew Jackson. Monroe tried to remain above the factionalism, but it was exhausting. He was getting old. He suffered from recurring health problems. His right hand had been injured years before and caused him pain. He looked forward to retirement. The final years in office. Monroe's second term saw continued work on internal improvements and western expansion. He supported federal funding for roads and canals. though he was careful to do so in ways that did not violate his strict constructionist principles. He believed the Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress the power to fund internal improvements, so he supported a constitutional amendment to authorize such spending. Congress never passed the amendment, but Monroe found other ways to support infrastructure development. In 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette, the French general who had fought for American independence, made a triumphal tour of the United States. Monroe welcomed him warmly. The two old soldiers, both in their 60s now, embraced and reminisced about the Revolution. Lafayette visited all 24 states, greeted everywhere as a hero. His visit was a reminder of the revolutionary generation that was passing away. Monroe was one of the last of them still alive and active in public life. The presidential election of 1824 was chaotic and bitter. 4 major candidates competed for the presidency: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. No candidate won a majority of electoral votes, throwing the election into the House of Representatives. The House chose Adams, despite Jackson having won the most popular and electoral votes. Jackson's supporters cried foul, claiming a corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay. Monroe stayed out of the controversy. He had remained neutral during the campaign, refusing to endorse any candidate. He welcomed Adams as his successor and prepared to leave office. On March 4, 1825, Monroe attended Adams's inauguration and then departed Washington for the last time as president. He was 66 years old and had spent nearly his entire adult life in public service. He was ready to go home. Retirement and financial ruin. Monroe retired to Oak Hill, his plantation in Loudoun County, Virginia, near Leesburg. It was a beautiful property of approximately 3,500 acres that he had purchased in 1808. He had built a brick mansion there designed by Thomas Jefferson. Oak Hill would be his home for the next 6 years. Monroe had hoped for a peaceful retirement, but he was plagued by financial problems. He had spent decades in public service, much of it in positions that required him to spend his own money for official expenses. The foreign missions to France and England had been particularly expensive. Monroe had paid for staff, entertainment, and other expenses out of his own pocket, expecting the government to reimburse him. But the government reimbursements were slow in coming and never adequate. Monroe had gone into debt during his years of service, and now in retirement the debts were coming due. He owned substantial property, but land values had collapsed during the Panic of 1819. He owned many enslaved people, but their labour could not generate enough income to service his debts. Monroe spent much of his retirement petitioning Congress for reimbursement of his expenses. He submitted detailed accounts of his expenditures during his years as minister to France and England, asking Congress to pay what he was owed. Some members of Congress were sympathetic. Others argued that Monroe had been adequately compensated at the time and was now simply trying to extract more money from the Treasury. The debate dragged on for years. In 1826, Congress finally appropriated $30,000 for Monroe, a fraction of what he claimed he was owed. It was not nearly enough to resolve his financial problems. Monroe also served on the Board of Visitors for the University of Virginia, working with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to establish and oversee the new university. It was one of Jefferson's great projects, and Monroe was happy to contribute. The 3 old friends, the last of the Virginia dynasty, met regularly at the university, discussing education and politics and the future of the Republic. In 1826, both Jefferson and Adams died on July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Monroe mourned his old friends and mentors. He was increasingly isolated now, one of the last survivors of the revolutionary generation. Monroe's health began to decline in the late 1820s. He developed a chronic cough, a sign of the tuberculosis that was taking root in his lungs. He tired easily. His hand pain worsened. He spent more time resting, less time actively managing his plantations. In 1829, Monroe was elected to the Virginia Constitutional Convention, a body charged with revising the state constitution. He was chosen as president of the convention, an honor that recognized his stature, but he was too ill to serve effectively. He attended some sessions but was often absent due to illness. He resigned the presidency of the convention due to failing health. The final blow, on September 23, 1830, Elizabeth Monroe died suddenly at Oak Hill. She had been Monroe's wife for 44 years, his partner through all the years of struggle and success. They had raised 3 children together, though only 2 survived to adulthood. Their son James Spence Monroe had died in infancy. Their daughters Eliza and Maria had married and had children of their own. Elizabeth's death devastated Monroe. He had been dependent on her in ways that went beyond the practical. She had managed the household, supervised the slaves, handled the 1,000 details of daily life. Without her, Oak Hill felt empty and unbearable. Monroe's daughters, Eliza and Maria, were concerned about their father living alone in his grief. They convinced him to leave Oak Hill and move to New York to live with Maria and her husband, Samuel Gouverneur. Monroe agreed, too exhausted and heartbroken to argue. He left Oak Hill in October 1830, never to return. The plantation he'd built, the home where he and Elizabeth had lived for nearly a quarter century, passed out of his hands. He would eventually be forced to sell it to pay his debts. Monroe moved into the Gouverneur home at 63 Prince Street in New York City. The house was comfortable, and Maria and Samuel were attentive to Monroe's needs. But Monroe was failing. The tuberculosis was advancing. The cough that had plagued him for years grew worse. He could not rest, could not sleep properly, could not eat much. By December 1830, Monroe was confined to his room. He was too weak to go out, too exhausted to do much beyond rest. He wrote a final letter to James Madison in April 1831, apologizing for his inability to attend a meeting of the University of Virginia's Board of Visitors. In the letter, Monroe acknowledged that he did not expect to recover, that his health was too far gone. He expressed regret that he would never see Madison again after so many years of friendship. Monroe made his will in May 1831, dividing his estate between his 2 daughters. There was little to divide. His debts exceeded his assets. What property remained would largely go to creditors. In his final weeks, Monroe could barely speak, his voice reduced to a whisper by the damage to his lungs. When he did speak, he talked about the Revolution, about his service to the nation, about his hope that the Union would endure. He worried about the sectional tensions over slavery, feared that the nation might tear itself apart. On his deathbed, Monroe made one final significant decision. He asked Samuel Gouverneur to free Peter Marks, an enslaved man who had served in the Monroe household for most of his life. Gouverneur honored Monroe's dying request, making Peter Marks the only enslaved person Monroe ever freed. It was too little and far too late, but it was something. And then came July 4th, 1831. The death. On the afternoon of July 4th, 1831, James Monroe lay in his bed in the upstairs room of the Gouverneur home. The sounds of celebration drifted up from the street. Church bells rang. Cannons fired. People gathered for Independence Day festivities, unaware that upstairs in a modest townhouse, one of the men who had helped create that independence was dying. Monroe's breathing had become laboured. Each breath was a struggle. Maria sat beside him, holding his hand, watching her father's face. Samuel Gouverneur stood nearby. A doctor had been called, but there was nothing to be done. Monroe's heart was giving out, worn down by age and illness, and the tuberculosis that had ravaged his lungs. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Monroe's breathing changed. The struggles became shallower, more irregular, and then, between one breath and the next, he stopped. His face relaxed. The pain that had marked his features for months eased away. James Monroe was dead. Maria wept, but there was also relief. Her father's suffering was over. He had held on for months, fighting with the same determination he had brought to every challenge in his life. But now he could rest. The death was announced immediately. Church bells that had been ringing in celebration began tolling in mourning. Flags were lowered to half-mast. The newspapers rushed to print special editions announcing that the former president had died on Independence Day, exactly 5 years after Jefferson and Adams. The coincidence struck everyone who heard the news. 3 of the first 5 presidents, 3 of the founding fathers, all dying on the 4th of July. It seemed impossible, as if Providence itself had ordained these deaths to mark the holiday of the nation's birth. The funeral. James Monroe's funeral was held on July 7, 1831, 3 days after his death. Thousands of mourners followed the hearse through the streets of New York. The procession moved slowly up Broadway, accompanied by militia units, civic organizations, and ordinary citizens who came to pay their respects to the last president of the revolutionary generation. Church bells tolled across the city. Guns fired salutes from the battery. Ships in the harbour lowered their flags. The procession reached the New York City Marble Cemetery on 2nd Street, where the Gouverneur family vault was located. Monroe was laid to rest in the Gouverneur Vault, a temporary resting place as it turned out. The funeral service was simple and dignified, befitting a man who had never sought ostentatious display. Tributes were read, acknowledging Monroe's service to the nation as soldier, diplomat, and president. But the mood was somber. An era had ended. The last of the Virginia dynasty was gone. Monroe's death was noted in newspapers across the country, but the tributes were brief and often perfunctory. He had been out of office for 6 years and public memory was short. Younger generations were coming to power who had not lived through the Revolution, who did not remember Monroe's service, who saw him as a relic of a bygone age. It would be 27 years before Monroe received his final resting place. In 1858, Virginia requested that Monroe's body be returned to his home state for reburial. The request was granted. On July 5, 1858, Monroe's coffin was exhumed from the Gouverneur Vault and transported by barge down the East River and then south to Virginia. The journey was not without incident. A storm struck during the voyage, nearly sinking the barge. When the barge finally reached Richmond, an accident during the unloading killed the grandson of Alexander Hamilton, the man Monroe had once nearly duelled. It was a grim reminder that history carries its own weight and exacts its own costs. Monroe was reinterred at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond on July 5, 1858, exactly 100 years and 2 months after his birth. A monument was later erected over his grave, a Gothic revival cage of iron that came to be called the Birdcage Tomb. It stands today in the President's Circle at Hollywood Cemetery, alongside the graves of John Tyler and Jefferson Davis. Elizabeth Monroe was eventually moved from Oak Hill to rest beside her husband at Hollywood Cemetery, as were their daughter, Maria, and her husband, Samuel Gouverneur. The family was reunited in death in a way that circumstances had often prevented in life. The legacy. What James Monroe left behind was complex and often contradictory. He presided over what was called the era of good feelings, but the unity of that era was superficial, papering over sectional divisions that would tear the nation apart within a generation. He claimed to oppose slavery, but owned slaves his entire life, and freed only one. He articulated the Monroe Doctrine, which became a cornerstone of American foreign policy. but he died in poverty, unable to afford even his own home. Monroe's presidency is often overlooked in the grand narrative of American history. He served between the more famous Madison and the more transformative Jackson. His achievements were real, but not dramatic. He did not remake the nation the way Jefferson did, or preserve it the way Washington did. He governed competently during a time of relative peace and prosperity, and that itself was perhaps achievement enough. The Monroe Doctrine endures as his most significant legacy. The principle that European powers should not interfere in the Americas became fundamental to American foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt expanded it into the Roosevelt Corollary, asserting American police power over Latin America. John F. Kennedy invoked it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even in the 21st century, the Monroe Doctrine shapes American thinking about hemispheric affairs. Monroe's acquisition of Florida secured America's southern border and removed a potential base for hostile forces. His negotiation of the Transcontinental Treaty established clear boundaries and set the stage for westward expansion. These were significant achievements that shaped the nation's geography and destiny. But Monroe's legacy is also shadowed by what he failed to do. He failed to address slavery meaningfully, failed to challenge the system that he claimed to oppose. The Missouri Compromise that he supported merely postponed the reckoning. When that reckoning came in the Civil War, 40 years after Monroe's presidency, the nation paid a terrible price for the failure of his generation to confront the contradiction between slavery and freedom. Monroe himself seems to have understood this failure, at least in part. In his final days, when he freed Peter Marks, he was acknowledging something he had known all along, that human bondage was wrong, that slavery was incompatible with the principles of the Revolution. But one man freed at the end of one man's life could not atone for a lifetime of compromise with injustice. The man behind the monument. Who was James Monroe beyond the titles and achievements? He was described by contemporaries as tall and dignified, formal in manner but warm in private. He stood over 6 feet tall, an imposing figure in an age when most men were much shorter. He had blue-grey eyes that observers found kind and penetrating. In his later years, his hair turned grey and then white, and he wore it long and tied back in a queue, in the old-fashioned style of the 18th century. He dressed in the clothing of the revolutionary generation even when fashions had changed, wearing knee breeches and buckled shoes long after most men had adopted trousers. This was partly nostalgia, partly a statement of identity. Monroe was proud to be a Revolutionary War veteran, and he wanted people to remember that he came from that founding generation. His manner was formal and courteous. He did not have Jefferson's charm or Madison's brilliance in conversation, but people found him trustworthy and sincere. John Quincy Adams, who worked closely with Monroe, said that if you turned Monroe's soul inside out, there would not be a spot on it. It was high praise from a man not given to flattery. Monroe was a devoted husband and father. His marriage to Elizabeth lasted 44 years and by all accounts was happy. He doted on his daughters, worried about their welfare, and provided for them as well as his limited resources allowed. When Elizabeth died, Monroe was utterly lost without her. He was not an intellectual in the way Jefferson or Madison were. He did not read voraciously or write philosophical treatises, but he was intelligent and capable, with good judgment and practical wisdom. He understood people, understood politics, understood how to navigate complex situations and build coalitions. Monroe's greatest weakness was perhaps his financial management. He consistently spent more than he earned, living beyond his means in order to maintain the appearance and dignity appropriate to his positions. This was partly necessary. Foreign ministers were expected to entertain lavishly, and the government reimbursements were never adequate. But Monroe also simply was not good with money. He made poor investments, bought land at inflated prices, and failed to adequately manage his plantations. The result was that a man who served his country faithfully for half a century died in debt and poverty, dependent on his daughter's charity. It was a sad end for someone who had given so much to the nation. The Revolution's last light. James Monroe was the last president who had fought in the Revolutionary War. He was the last president to wear the old-fashioned knee breeches and buckled shoes. He was the last of what was called the Virginia dynasty, the succession of Virginia presidents who dominated the early republic. His death marked the end of an era in a very literal sense. The generation that had fought for independence, that had created the Constitution, that had established the republic was passing away. Jefferson and Adams died in 1826. Madison would die in 1836. Monroe's death in 1831 was part of that final passing. What followed was a different America. Andrew Jackson's presidency would transform American politics, creating a more democratic but also more contentious political culture. The question of slavery would grow more urgent with each passing year, finally erupting in civil war in 1861. The westward expansion that Monroe had helped facilitate would bring new states, new conflicts, and the final displacement of Native American peoples. Monroe could not have prevented these developments. He was a product of his time, limited by its prejudices and assumptions. But he contributed to creating a nation that would eventually, painfully, move beyond those limitations. The principles of the Monroe Doctrine, adapted and reinterpreted, would help define American power in the 20th century. The Union that Monroe worked to preserve would survive its greatest crisis and emerge stronger. There is a monument in Westmoreland County, Virginia, marking the spot where James Monroe was born. There is a museum in Fredericksburg where his law office once stood. There is the birdcage tomb at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. There is Highland, his Albemarle County home, now preserved and open to visitors. There is Oak Hill in Loudoun County, still standing though in private hands. And there is, most significantly, the doctrine that bears his name, the statement that the Americas are a sphere distinct from Europe, that the New World will not submit to Old World domination. It was not entirely original to Monroe. It was shaped by John Quincy Adams, and it was only enforceable because Britain's navy backed it up. But it carried Monroe's name into history, and it shaped American foreign policy for generations. Monroe died knowing that he had served his country well, even if the country had not served him well in return. He died knowing that the Union endured, even if he worried about its future. He died as he'd lived, with dignity and a quiet determination to do his duty. The boy from Westmoreland County, the lieutenant who crossed the Delaware, the diplomat who helped purchase Louisiana, the president who presided over the era of good feelings, had returned at last to the earth from which he came. The journey was over. The long service was complete. A final reflection. On that July 4th in 1831, as James Monroe drew his final breath, the nation he had helped build was celebrating its 55th birthday. The coincidence of his death with that of Jefferson and Adams before him seemed to suggest some deep connection between these men and the nation they had served. Perhaps it was simply chance. 3 men who had lived long lives, who had lived to see the nation they created flourish, dying on the anniversary of its birth. Perhaps there was no deeper meaning, no grand design. Or perhaps it was fitting that the last of the Founding Father presidents should leave the world on the day that marked the nation's birth, as if to say that the work of founding was complete, that a new generation must now take up the task of preserving and perfecting what had been begun. Monroe would have appreciated that symmetry. He was a man who believed in the Union, who had given his life to its service, who had tried in his own imperfect way to build something that would outlast him. Whether he succeeded is for history to judge. What we can say is that James Monroe served. He served as a teenage soldier carrying a bullet in his shoulder from Trenton. He served as a diplomat navigating the treacherous waters of revolutionary France and Napoleonic Europe. He served as a governor, a cabinet secretary, and a president. He served for half a century, giving his energy, his health, and ultimately his fortune to the nation. And when he could serve no more, when his body gave out, and his lungs failed and his heart stopped, he died on the 4th of July, as if the nation itself claimed him at last, taking him home on its birthday. Thank you for listening to this journey through the life of James Monroe. If you enjoyed this biography, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what you'd like to hear about next. These stories of remarkable lives are meant to be shared, and I'm grateful you chose to spend this time here. Until next time, sleep well and good night.